The text arrived at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon from a number Boone Ridley didn't recognize, and it said 5 words that stopped him mid-sentence in a conversation he'd forget entirely by the next morning. He broke my arm. He read it twice before he understood it wasn't a joke, wasn't spam, wasn't meant for him at all. An elderly woman's shaking thumb had hit one wrong digit while typing a number she'd dialed 1,000 times before, and instead of reaching her daughter, she'd reached a stranger 3 counties away who happened to be sitting at his kitchen table with his phone face up beside his coffee. Boone typed back before he'd fully decided to. "I'm on my way. Where are you?" What happened over the next 90 minutes would end with 84 motorcycles filling a quiet residential street in Thistlewood, Pennsylvania, and a son who believed his mother had no one left to call, learning exactly how wrong he'd been. Thistlewood sat in the hill country an hour outside Pittsburgh, a town of church steeples and porch swings where most people still knew which houses belonged to which families going back 3 generations. The town's one stoplight blinked yellow after 6 most evenings, and the volunteer fire department still ran a Friday fish fry that half the county showed up for out of habit more than hunger. Boone Ridley had grown up 2 streets over from where he lived now, working as a locksmith out of a van that said Ridley Lock and Key on the side in letters he'd painted himself, and had been a member of the Iron Vow Motorcycle Club for 11 years, ever since a chapter member had helped him rebuild a garage that fire insurance wouldn't cover. Boone was 39 years old, built compact and quick rather than broad, with hands steadier than most surgeons from 2 decades of picking locks for a living, and a habit of noticing things other people walked past. A screen door that didn't latch right, a porch step that gave slightly more than it should, a neighbor's mail piling up 2 days longer than usual. He'd learned to notice small wrongnesses as a trade skill, and it turned out the same instinct worked on people as well as hardware. His own grandmother had spent her last 2 years in a house where nobody checked on her often enough, a fall down her own basement stairs, going undiscovered for the better part of a day because the one neighbor who might have noticed had moved away the year before. And Boone had promised himself, standing at her funeral at 22 years old, that he'd never again walk past a wrongness he could have stopped. He kept that promise the way some men keep a favorite tool close at hand, not as a rule he thought about often, but as something built so deep into how he moved through the world that he rarely had to decide anything at all. He was at his kitchen table finishing a late lunch when the text came through, glanced at it assuming it was a wrong number entirely, the kind of message you delete and forget, and then read the words again and felt something in his chest go completely still. Before we get any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next 90 minutes weren't about a stranger doing one kind thing and moving on. They were about what happens when an 84-person motorcycle club decides a wrong number isn't a reason to look away from somebody in trouble. Now, back to a woman named Vivian and the 8 months that led to that text. Vivian Sorensen was 76 years old, a widow of 4 years, and had lived in the same small house on Chestnut Lane for 41 of them, ever since she and her husband Harold bought it the year their son Curtis was born. She still kept Harold's recliner in the corner of the living room exactly where he'd left it, still watered the rose bushes he'd planted along the fence line, and still wrote in a small leather journal every night before bed, a habit she'd kept since Harold's funeral, because writing down the ordinary parts of a day, what she'd eaten, what the weather had done, whether the mail had come early or late, made the days feel less like they were disappearing without a record. She had taught piano lessons out of her living room for 30 years, and still kept a framed photograph on the wall of every student who'd ever finished a full year with her. 40-some faces going back to the 1980s, most of them grown now with children of their own, who had no idea their pediatrician or their high school principal had once struggled through scales in that same living room. The house had been full of sound for 3 decades. Scales and simple songs and the occasional recital audience of proud parents crowded onto folding chairs, and the silence that had settled over it in the last 8 months was one Vivian had never fully gotten used to, even after telling herself repeatedly that quiet houses were only what happened once children grew and moved away. 8 months ago, Curtis had shown up at her door with 2 suitcases and a divorce he didn't want to discuss, having lost his job the same month his marriage ended. And Vivian had done what any mother in her position might do. She let him move back into his childhood bedroom, told herself it was temporary, and quietly began covering more of the household expenses out of her fixed Social Security income than she'd ever planned to. Carol, 3 hours away in Columbus, had asked more than once over the phone whether everything was all right, and Vivian had told her every time that Curtis was going through a hard stretch and would find his feet soon enough. The particular optimism of a mother who had spent 45 years believing the best about her son and did not yet know how to stop. Curtis was 45 years old and had spent most of his adult life a half step behind wherever he'd hoped to be. A business degree he never finished. A marriage that ran 12 years before it collapsed under debts he'd mostly generated himself. A series of jobs that always ended before he was due for a review he suspected wouldn't go well. He had never once, in his mother's presence, described any of this as his own doing. It was always the economy, or a boss who hadn't given him a fair shot, or a wife who hadn't understood what he was working toward. Vivian had spent 45 years hearing this version of events, and had only recently begun to notice how rarely, across all those years, the story ever included a single choice Curtis himself might have made differently. It hadn't stayed simple for long. Curtis drank most evenings, and the drinking had a way of turning small disagreements into something considerably uglier. An argument about the electric bill, a comment about how long he'd been between jobs, anything that touched the fragile pride of a 45-year-old man living in his mother's spare bedroom. Vivian had learned to keep the peace the way people in her position often learn to, by not asking questions, by handing over what he asked for before he had to ask twice, by telling herself that things would improve once he found work. She had stopped inviting her piano lesson families over for the small recitals she used to host twice a year, quietly, without ever explaining to anyone exactly why. That Thursday afternoon, Curtis had asked for $60 from her purse, and when Vivian hesitated, not refused, only hesitated, because the checking account was already thinner than she'd let herself admit. Thin enough that she'd been quietly skipping her own blood pressure medication every 3rd day to stretch the refill an extra 2 weeks. Something in him snapped in a way it never fully had before. He grabbed her arm to pull the purse away from her, harder than either of them expected. And the sound it made when her wrist gave way was a sound Vivian would hear again every night for months afterward, long after the cast came off and the bone had knit itself back together. Curtis left the house within minutes, muttering something about needing air, and Vivian sat alone at her kitchen table with her arm cradled against her chest, shaking too hard to think clearly, and did the only thing that occurred to her. She picked up her phone to call her daughter Carol, 3 hours away in Columbus, and her trembling fingers hit a 4 instead of a 7 on the last digit of a number she'd dialed 1,000 times. She didn't realize her mistake until the reply came back. "I'm on my way. Where are you?" "Who is this?" she typed back, hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to hit send. "A friend," Boone answered. "Are you safe right now? Is he still there?" "He left," Vivian wrote. "I don't know where. My arm. I think it's broken." Boone was already pulling his boots on. "Have you called 911? "I'm scared to," Vivian wrote, after a pause long enough that Boone had already started composing a second message. "He's my son. That single sentence told Boone more than a paragraph could have. "Why are you scared to call them?" he wrote, already suspecting the answer before it came. "Because then everyone will know," Vivian wrote. "And he's still my boy, even now. I don't know how to explain that to a stranger." "You don't have to explain anything to me," Boone wrote back. "You only have to let me help. I'm calling them for you right now. Tell me your address. I'm coming either way." She gave it to him. 214 Chestnut Lane, and Boone called 911 himself before his bike had even left the driveway, giving the dispatcher every detail Vivian had sent him while he rode, spelling out the address twice to be certain, and then did the thing that had become instinct over 11 years in the Iron Vow. He sent a single message to the chapter group text, 4 words long, and by the time he reached the county line, riders were already peeling off from garages and driveways across 3 townships to meet him there. A retired nurse in the chapter, hearing the address, recognized it immediately as the house where her own daughter had once taken piano lessons, and said so out loud to no one in particular before she'd even finished pulling on her gloves. He arrived at 214 Chestnut Lane 9 minutes before the county sheriff did, and found Curtis Sorensen standing in the driveway, having circled back home once his temper cooled enough to worry about what his mother might do next. "Can I help you?" Curtis asked, unbothered, the posture of a man who'd talked his way out of worse than a stranger on a motorcycle before. "I'm here for Vivian." 4 words. "She's fine. She had a fall." Curtis's tone stayed easy. "I don't know who told you otherwise, but this is a family matter, and I'd appreciate you getting off our property." "She told me herself." Boone didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Broken arm, not a fall. Curtis's easy expression held for exactly 1 more second before something harder replaced it. "You don't know anything about what happens in this house." "I know enough." Boone stepped past him toward the porch. "Vivian?" "It's Boone. I'm the one who texted you back." The front door opened before Curtis could stop it, and Vivian stood there, arm cradled against her chest, tears on her face but her spine straighter than Boone expected from the shakiness of her texts. "You came," she whispered. Disbelief threaded through the 2 words like she still hadn't fully accepted a stranger's reply had been real. She didn't say anything else. She only nodded once, the particular nod of someone confirming a stranger was exactly who they'd claimed to be. Curtis's face went through several fast stages: confusion, then anger, then something closer to panic as he did the math on how quickly a private argument had become a witnessed one. "This isn't your business," he said, louder now, stepping toward the porch himself. "It is now." 3 words. "I'll call the police myself," Curtis said. "Tell them you're trespassing, harassing my mother, already called them." Boone didn't move from where he stood between Curtis and the door. "They're 4 minutes out. While we wait, you should know something else." "What's that?" "You should check the street." Curtis's confidence, which had held through the last several exchanges, showed its first real crack at that sentence. The tone of a man who has realized the ground beneath an argument has shifted somewhere he can't see yet. Curtis turned, and that was when the sound reached him. Low at first, easy to mistake for a passing truck until it kept building instead of fading, converging on Chestnut Lane from both directions at once the way weather gathers before it commits to arriving altogether. "What is that?" Curtis asked, his voice thinner than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Boone didn't answer. He didn't need to. Engines, first, and then chrome catching the late afternoon light along the length of Chestnut Lane. 84 motorcycles rolling in from both ends of the street in a slow, disciplined column, filling driveways and curb space for 3 houses in either direction. Engines dying in sequence until the street held nothing but the tick of 84 cooling engines, and a silence deep enough that porch lights up and down the block began flicking on despite the daylight. Neighbors drawn outside by a quiet more startling than any noise could have been. A woman 2 doors down, who had lived beside Vivian for over a decade without ever learning much beyond her name, stood frozen on her own steps with a hand pressed to her chest. Not one rider looked at Curtis Sorensen, not a single glance in his direction, as though the man standing in his mother's driveway had already stopped mattering to the 84 people who now filled the street around him. He stood motionless in that silence, the $60 he'd fought for that afternoon feeling, for the first time, like the smallest and least important thing in the world. A woman stepped off the lead bike. The chapter's road captain, silver-haired, a patch over her heart that read Grandmother's Guard, a program the club had quietly run for 6 years for exactly afternoons like this one. She walked past Curtis without a glance and climbed the porch steps to stand beside Vivian. "You're safe now," she said. 3 words, and something in Vivian's shoulders finally came down from where they'd been braced since 4:47 that afternoon. The sheriff's cruiser arrived 2 minutes later, followed by an ambulance Boone had also requested, and it took the deputies considerably less time than Curtis had clearly hoped to piece together a broken arm, a mother's texted account, and 84 witnesses who'd arrived before the county's own response time could have gotten there first. He didn't deserve more of this story than that. He didn't get more. Curtis was charged with assault and elder abuse, charges made simpler by the fact that Vivian's texts to Boone, timestamped and unedited, laid out the entire sequence of events more clearly than any statement given after the fact could have. The county prosecutor told Carol later that a contemporaneous text record like that one was the kind of evidence most elder abuse cases never had the benefit of, since victims rarely reach out to anyone at all in the actual moment, let alone leave behind an unbroken written trail of exactly what happened and when. Vivian's arm was set at the county hospital that evening, a clean fracture that would heal in 6 weeks with a cast, and considerably longer than that in every other way. Carol drove in from Columbus the next morning and moved her mother's things into her own house within the week, a conversation Vivian had been too frightened to have for 8 months finally happening, because a stranger's reply had made the first, hardest part, admitting it out loud, impossible to take back. "I should have told you sooner," Vivian whispered to her daughter that first night in the new guest room, and Carol, sitting on the edge of the bed, told her there was no sooner that would have undone 8 months of a mother protecting a son who hadn't earned it. Boone still has the original text thread saved on his phone, unable to bring himself to delete a wrong number that turned into the reason he checks in on Vivian every single week now, usually over pie at the diner in town, where she started keeping a second leather journal, only for the ordinary, unremarkable days that came after. She's begun teaching piano again, too. Only 1 student so far, a granddaughter of one of the riders who showed up that afternoon, and the sound of scales drifting through her front windows on Tuesday evenings has become, for at least one street in Thistlewood, a small and reliable proof that a house can fill back up with the right kind of noise. She keeps Boone's first reply saved at the top of her own phone, too, the words worn soft from how many times she's reread them on harder nights since. "I'm on my way." 5 words that came from a stranger, meant for someone else entirely, and arrived at exactly the moment they were needed most. If this story reached you, if you believe that showing up for a stranger is sometimes the difference between somebody surviving a Thursday and not, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that the smallest mistake, a single wrong digit, can still find its way to exactly the right person. Subscribe to Iron Vow Stories so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever texted the wrong number? And what happened next?